Good morning and good afternoon, everybody. This is Andy Crawford with Pensight. Hey, we're going to give everybody another couple minutes to join today. So give us about 60 seconds. I see the attendee list is populating and populating quickly. Christy, how are you today?
I'm doing well, Andy. Thanks for asking. I'm looking forward to this webinar.
Outstanding. I know we've got a lot of material to cover, and I've got a lot of people who are going to be joining us today, so that's always exciting. Well, we'll go ahead and get things kicked off here. I want to thank everybody for joining us today on our webinar about Don't Be Fooled, Prevent Biases from Wreaking Havoc on Your Talent Decisions. This has been pre-approved by the HR Certification Institute for one general recertification credit towards your PHR, your SPHR, and your GPHR. All we ask is to earn that credit is that you stay on the webinar for the entire webinar, and then after the webinar is over, we'll send the activity ID so you can submit it for your certification credit. So once again, we do appreciate everybody joining today. We hope you find the topic relevant, useful. Hope you are able to take information back to your peers and share with them. So so this is going to be an exciting topic today. When you start talking about biases at the workplace and on your talent decisions, I know I've got a teenage daughter, and she's constantly telling me that my decisions to let her do the things with some of her peers is biased based upon things that other kids may be doing at school that she doesn't do. So I'm accused of being biased on a daily basis. So this is a topic I should probably take some notes on, or maybe even share with my daughter. So Christy, do you help with teen counseling with regard to bias?
I haven't done a whole lot in that regard, but I think that would be quite the challenge in that situation.
Might have to put you to work. But once again, thanks everybody. My name is Andy Crawford, as I had mentioned earlier, and I'm with Pensight. And you know, I'll brag on Pensight for a moment here. We've received several awards over the past couple years, but we just recently received another award from the Brandon Hall Group. This is with regard to Excellence in Learning Award with the use of technology. Christy Panico is a big part of that development team. I want to thank Christy for all of her efforts in this and really helping kind of push us to the forefront. So without further ado, I'm going to let Christy introduce herself.
Great, thank you, Andy. So as Andy mentioned, my name is Christy Panico. My background is in industrial organizational psychology. And at Pensight, I oversee the research and development primarily of our talent solutions, so our virtual simulations that we offer. And as I mentioned, I'm very excited about this webinar. I taught at the university level for a number of years, and this was always my favorite topic to talk about. So I'm very excited to be talking about it with all of you here today.
Fantastic. Thank you, Christy. This is, I'm really looking forward to this. I'll mention too that in your bar on on the screen there is an area for questions. If you have questions as we go along, please shoot those in there and we'll address them you know, during the webinar, but we also try to leave time at the very end to address these questions. So fire away with the questions. And looking forward to everybody's input and thoughts as we go through this. So Christy, I'll go ahead and be quiet and turn it over to you.
Great, thanks for the introduction, Andy. So today in the webinar, we'll be talking about where do biases come from, how do we identify these, what are common biases in talent management decisions and more generally, and then most importantly, how do we avoid biased decision-making in talent decisions. But before we jump into the webinar, I wanted to start with a little bit of trivia, a little trivia question here. So without Googling this, please, is the longest river in China longer than 700 miles? And if so, or either way, how long is it in miles? So we ask that, one, you don't Google this, and then secondly, that you put your answer in the chat box. So we'll give you guys a few minutes here to submit your answers. And again, this is just your best guess.
See if we have anybody out there who's ready to be on Jeopardy. Do they need to answer this in the form of a question, just like that?
They do not. But they are welcome to.
We got some answers coming in. Thank you.
Okay, so it looks like we've had a number of answers that have come in. And unfortunately, most people are way off on their estimation. So the river that we're referring to is the Yangtze, I think that's how you pronounce that, river, and the length is actually 3,915 miles. And so why are most people off in their estimations? Well, first of all, it seems like you didn't Google it, like I asked, so thank you. But secondly, because of one opinion, and that is the opinion that I put in the question. Is this more or less than 700 miles? So unconsciously, your brain assumes that the question itself has some authority, some innate knowledge about the length of this river. And if a simple question can influence you, imagine how much an authority figure, a colleague, a peer, and the relationships that you have with these people can influence you without even knowing it. So that was a simple demonstration just to show the extent of biases and really how they impact so many decisions that we make unconsciously without us knowing. There's so much that's affecting us that we're not really aware of. And that, of course, will be the focus of the webinar today. So we are faced with about 11 million pieces of information at any given moment. According to a professor at psychology at the University of Virginia. And the brain can only process about 40 of these bits of information. At the same time, we're making around 35,000 decisions a day. Some of these very small, some of these you're unconsciously making a decision. But the point of this is that there's a lot of information that our brain is doing, and that this is very difficult computationally for our brain to process all of this information. It's just not humanly possible to be able to process all of the information we receive and really process all of the decisions that we make. So as I mentioned, our brain is really doing the heavy lifting there. All that computation and processing to make so many decisions is indeed taxing. And our brain has been estimated to have the capacity of about 1 million gigabytes, which allows for very quick processing of information, but still not enough to process how much we need to on a daily basis. So the solution has been that our brain has developed tricks or shortcuts of ways to deal with this, of ways to quickly and efficiently make decisions. That's why we're able to make 35,000 decisions a day without even knowing that we're making that many decisions a day. And these are often referred to as heuristics. So heuristics allow for extremely quick decision-making, ideally effective decision-making, but that's really not always the case. So they're sometimes referred to as mental shortcuts or rules of thumb. And this definition that I've presented here comes from Daniel Kahneman. He was a Nobel Prize winner for his work in this area. And he defines this as simple procedures that help find adequate, though often imperfect, answers to difficult questions. So the issue here is that we know heuristics fail. They are often imperfect. They can fail in unpredictable ways. So they're shortcuts or rules of thumbs that they don't always work. Similar to general guidelines, they don't always work in every situation. However, they can also fail in predictable ways. And that's when we get into biases. So as I mentioned, biases happen when heuristics fail, or in some cases when these are abused. The heuristic is the mental shortcut. The bias is when this doesn't work for us, or it is abused in a situation. So I'll give you an example here. For example, there's the confirmation heuristic. And this suggests that if we're leaning towards one option, we're going to seek to find evidence that proves that that's really the best option. That seems quite rational. So for example, you're buying a car, you'll look at reviews, prices, maybe talk to people that own that car, test drive it. You're looking for information to support your decision to purchase that car. But the confirmation bias happens when not only are we searching for information to support our decision, but we start only looking for evidence that confirms our decision. We start to ignore or rationalize evidence that doesn't confirm our decision, which leads us to think that it is a stronger decision than it is. But really, it's just the way that we're processing that information. We're really seeking confirming information. So biases, they come in many different forms, and I would say most forms are relevant for succession planning decisions. People characterize or group biases into different categories, and I found these three categories really to be the clearest way to organize or separate them. But the categorization really is not all that important here. What's more important is understanding that they come in many different forms. So there are cognitive biases. These happen to our cognition, the way we think, the tendencies to think in certain ways. There's also social biases. So these occur in our attributions of others when we attempt to explain or understand why someone did what they did. There can also be social biases as attitudes towards particular groups, races, sexes, religions, whatever it may be. And these, again, are conscious and unconscious expressions of our attitudes. And then there's motivational biases. These biases are distorted thinking, distort our thinking or our process, our cognition, and this tends to be motivated by the individual situation and the way we process information based on that specific situation. So the take-home message here is really that they are everywhere, that they affect everyone, and that oftentimes we're not even aware that these are affecting us. So a lot of research has been done in terms of, are there individual differences in how these affect people? And while there are some, research strongly suggests that regardless of your cognitive style, age, intelligence, gender, race, whatever it may be, that everyone is really affected by these biases to some degree, and that no one is immune. It's not a matter of people not working hard enough or not trying hard enough or being lazy. We are just biologically pre-wired to make these errors. So I'll turn to you, what does this really mean for succession planning? So succession planning is, of course, a decision-making process and a relatively complex decision-making process. And the research suggests that we're more likely to commit biases when we're making complex decisions. So let's take a quick example that comes from Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow, which I highly recommend if you haven't had the chance to read it. So his research suggests that when our mind has a difficult question to answer, we're more likely to use shortcuts. And he provides a number of examples of questions that would be difficult for our mind to answer and how our brain actually goes about answering these questions. So one example he provides in his book is the actual question that people will be asked is, how popular will the president be in 6 months from now? But the question we really answer is, how popular is that president right now? So translated to succession planning, that looks like this. The actual question is, how successful will John be in the next leadership level 6 months from now? However, the question we answer, the question our brain immediately goes to answering, is how successful is John in the current leadership level right now? And so at a high level, we can immediately see the problem here. And then to further support this, Kahneman's research suggests that we're especially likely to make mental shortcuts when it comes to numbers, as numbers have a greater propensity for making people uncomfortable. So if we look at the traditional succession planning approach, it looks something like this. We typically start with calibrating and training managers to make accurate ratings. Sometimes this is done, sometimes this is not done. But traditionally then this is followed by collecting the manager's ratings. So taking ratings of managers, maybe peers if 360 is used, and then after all these ratings are collected and organized, there's discussion meetings with senior leadership teams regarding individual employees, where they fall in the 9 box, helping to try and identify who the high potentials or employees are. So note that these 3 phases all involve making complex decisions about other people, and they also involve numbers. So we aren't even talking about one person's bias here and heuristics coming into play. If we're using multiple managers' ratings, or if we're using 360s, there's multiple people's biases and heuristics that are going to be affecting this process before it even gets to the senior leadership team to discuss. And senior leadership is not immune from this either, so this issue gets further compounded really the further along we go in this process. Not to mention the inordinate amount of time that we spend collecting this information. When we consider how many errors are made in this process, I argue that we're essentially spending a whole lot of time collecting really bad data that we know is prone to error, and that's where we see succession planning decisions going wrong. So let's look at a few more concrete examples of what this actually looks like and how this might play out in succession planning decisions. The first one I start with is the halo effect. This is a very well-documented and incredibly pertinent heuristic to succession planning. So the halo effect happens when certain aspects of a person, typically positive qualities, but not always, shape our entire view of that person, and it's much more common than most people realize. So let's take an example. John did really well in this client presentation a few weeks ago. He was well-spoken, his points were clear, it was well-organized, he had a good pace, clients loved it. Now, you're completing those ratings of John, and naturally this is going to be the first thing that comes to your mind. And that seems reasonable. It is performance-related behavior. But the problem becomes that this single event is very likely to shape your entire view of John and influence ratings on competencies not related to that specific event. So say, for example, you're rating John on his potential to be a frontline manager. So arguably, presentation skills are important for leaders of all levels. Presentation skills alone do not make for a successful leader. So maybe you aren't sure how John is with mentoring and coaching, but your brain, when faced with this difficult decision and having to put a number to how good is John at mentoring and coaching, will unconsciously think, well, John's a great presenter, so he must be a great mentor and coach too. So this is a problem really here in 2 regards. One, presentation skills are not the same as mentoring and coaching, so we're getting error in those ratings. And secondly, just because John did well in that one presentation doesn't even mean that he's a strong presenter. Strong skills require consistent performance across situations. So our natural response in this situation is to assume John is great at everything because he did well in this one presentation, and this is really not rational thought. And the frightening part of this is that this happens naturally. This happens oftentimes without our awareness that we're even thinking this. So the next one I'll turn to, and you might be thinking, well, I don't do that. I think more rationally than most people. Well, the truth is that most people think they think more rationally than most people. So this is a classic example of a research study that's been replicated many, many times, and it's a simple exercise that demonstrates this. So can you guess how many the majority of people put this answer when asked to rate themselves as a driver? You probably guessed it. Most people put that they're above average. About 80% of people mark that they're above average when they're asked this question. Yet we know that it's statistically impossible for more than 50% of people to be above average. And we see this with succession planning all the time. Most executives and boards think that they make above average succession decisions, but the research suggests that that's quite the opposite. If people were making such effective succession planning decisions, we wouldn't have research suggesting that 50 to 60% of new leaders fail. This next one is closely related to overconfidence bias, and I hear this frequently as well. I know my talent, or we know our talent best. And this comes from the idea that we have expert intuition, that certain people have intuition and certain people don't, and that this intuition allows us to make better, more rational decisions based on what we know. But the research suggests that it's not as common as you think, that intuition is something that can be developed with practice if the learning environment is regular enough to be predictable and rapid feedback is available. But when it comes to succession planning, the learning environment is hardly ever predictable, and it can really take years to know if that decision was the right one. So there is no rapid feedback. And additionally, most boards and executives really don't get the experiences necessary as frequently as enough to be able to develop that expert intuition for succession planning. As a side note to this, we do see this pretty frequently with our simulation assessment results. So there's been a number of instances where the client or the board has kind of a golden child, a successor that they are absolutely confident is going to be the best. However, at some point, someone convinces them that maybe it's not the best decision, or maybe they need to get more evidence to support that decision, and so they put them through our simulation assessments. And then, lo and behold, the golden child is not the strongest performer. Sometimes this results in backlash. Other times, this is really used as information to probe further, but eventually, in our experience, clients typically come to the realization that there's a lot of validity in the assessment results in terms of the competency, strengths, and weaknesses, and that perhaps they were missing pieces of the puzzle when they had put all their confidence in the particular golden child. So now moving
Hey, Christy,
we
had a question come in that I thought might be relevant to what's going on. I was going to wait to the end. But their question, they're asking, is there a best way to break away from kind of the golden child model, the first in, first promoted, or promises made during the hiring process, to a more structured measurement process? Because it sounds like that's what they're going through right now, is they're trying to transition away from that type of bias.
Yes, absolutely. So we'll get to that a little bit further in the webinar as well, in terms of how you can start to transition away from the golden child, or the pet gets to be the pet successor or whatnot. But the number one way to do that is to really try and reduce the number of biases that come into play in that decision. So in a few moments, we'll get to that a little bit more about how you can start to reduce some of those biases. And then at the end, if you feel the question hasn't been sufficiently answered, please feel free to put it in the chat box, and I'll readdress it at that point.
Thank you.
Absolutely. So now we're moving on to some more of the social biases, and this next one is very, very common. Once you think about this, you can probably find multiple examples of doing this every day. I know I do. So the fundamental attribution error means that we tend to attribute bad things about our own actions to the situation, and good things about our own actions to personality or to our skills. But we do the opposite for others. We tend to attribute bad things about others to their personality or skills, and good things about the situation. So for example, if I'm underperforming at my job, I'm likely to say it's because I've been overworked, I've had outside issues affecting me, maybe I didn't have clear direction. All these explanations that are really about the situation, not about me personally or my skills level. Whereas if my colleague is underperforming, I'm more likely to attribute that to that person not being qualified, doesn't try hard enough, or other factors that are innate to that person's personality or the skill set that they have. And this really happens in all contexts and aspects of life. So I included the picture of driving because, at least for me personally, I notice that I commit this quite a bit when I'm driving. Someone will cut in front of me, or zip through lanes to get in front, and my first thought is always, oh, well, they think they're so much more important, or it's never, maybe they're in a real emergency. Maybe they're in a hurry to get somewhere. It's always something about them that is personal to them. And so I encourage you to think about this more often and see if you notice making this error as much as most people do on a daily basis. So in the context of succession planning, it's natural for us to attribute poor performance of other people to the person, to their lack of skills, to their personality, to their motivation, whereas we're not likely to do that with ourselves. And when we consider that much of succession planning decisions are the result of people rating others, it's easy to see why research suggests that more often than not, 360 ratings are telling us more about the person that's making those ratings than the person that's actually being rated. This is another social bias that we tend to see, particularly in succession planning decisions. So this is the tendency to favor one's own group. So as humans, we have survived to be group animals. So we like to have close-knit groups. We like to have groups that we associated with. And this oftentimes becomes a part of our identity. So if you ask someone to describe themselves, more often than not, they're going to list some type of group, whether that's a hobby, a sports group, a familial group, or some other type of group that they're a part of. We are human. As humans, we identify with groups. And as a result, we tend to have a bias or a tendency to favor our own group. And so this bias particularly came into play. There's a really interesting study in the 1950s called the Robbers Cave study, and their ultimate goal was really trying to figure out how do we get competing groups to reach a compromise and work together. But in order to really test that, they had to create the conflict between them. And they were able to do this very easily using the in-group bias. They simply paired Boy Scouts together and gave them an identity, did a couple things to create really that identity and build it up, and then lo and behold, before you knew it, they had the in-group bias. They were able to start developing that conflict and the competition between the two groups, so that then they could get to the real work, which is how do we fix this now? So if you have personal relationships with the individuals that we're making decisions for, and most likely you do, otherwise you probably wouldn't be making ratings of them, it's very difficult to be impartial, regardless of your intention. We will always prefer people that are in our group, that are in the in-group, no matter how trivial that basis of membership may be. It could be the same unit, the same team, the same department. And this is particularly relevant in succession decisions when we're asking managers to rate their direct reports. So not only do you have that in-group bias, this is part of my team, but managers often see this as a reflection of their own performance. So if your direct report isn't performing well, most managers see that this reflects on who they are as a manager, how successful they are as a manager. So in combination with the in-group bias, this really explains a lot in terms of why we see that managers consistently provide lenient ratings. They overinflate how well someone is performing. And then the last one that I'll share here or go into detail on is groupthink. So given succession planning often happens in the context of a group decision for senior leaders, this bias is especially pertinent. Groupthink happens when the desire to go along with the group, the desire for consensus in the group, leads to deteriorated rational thought. And oftentimes this causes groups to not only make irrational decisions, but sometimes immoral decisions as the group strives for consensus. And combined with the in-group bias, groups can start to feel a sense of protection or invulnerability, a false perception that they have made the right decision because everyone agrees with it. And so we've seen this play out in very horrific ways in the past. Indeed, much of this research really started as an attempt to understand how the Holocaust happened, how people were capable of doing such horrific things. And though hopefully less extreme in the workplace, this desire for consensus can be especially dangerous in the workplace. And this is more likely to occur in that traditional succession planning process when we get a group of colleagues together, some with more authority than others, and we attempt to make sense of numbers. So remember, numbers tend to make us more likely to commit these biases in the first place, and then we're trying to judge people on their potential for the future, something that's arguably a very complex and difficult task. So these biases and errors that we've shared are just a few of the many dozen that occur, and most of them will influence the way succession planning decisions are made. Now, I don't share all this to frighten you. I know that when I was first exposed to these biases and errors, I had a bit of an existential crisis questioning, all the thoughts and decisions we as humans make. But I share this because we are all prone to this, and it's very, very difficult for us as humans to make objective decisions about employees, about managers, even senior leadership teams, to evaluate people that we have a pre-existing relationship with. So what do we do about all this? Well, the first place to start is awareness, or what's called metacognition, thinking about your thinking. So being aware of biases and heuristics that humans are prone to make makes us more likely to be able to recognize them. We're not necessarily going to be able to stop ourselves from doing this, but you can recognize when that's happening afterwards if you're aware that this is something that occurs, and then you can start to challenge your own thinking. So I'm constantly asking myself, is this just my confirmation bias? Is this a fundamental attribution error? Agreed, I'm a nerdy psychologist, and that's something that I'm probably more likely to do than most, but awareness is something that we know everyone can do, and it's a really great starting point for starting to combat some of these biases. And again, I highly recommend Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow. It's a good place to start for awareness as well. The second thing we can do is training. So it's not possible to train people to never make these, but it is possible to train people on how to recognize them. So providing very specific examples of when this bias might occur, particularly, for example, in the rating context, and how to really challenge their thinking to avoid falling into those traps. The third thing we can do is making people accountable for their decisions. So people tend to challenge their thinking more, spend more time reflecting on their decisions when they are held accountable for the decisions they are making. So when we think about the context of succession planning, how often are our senior leaders or our leadership team held accountable for good or bad succession planning decisions? Of course, this is very difficult to do because it may be many years before we see the results, before the succession planning decisions, the result of that is really fully realized, whether that leader succeeds or fails. So in the context of succession planning, it's difficult to build in that accountability for decisions. The fourth thing we can do is allow more time to make decisions. So the errors and the biases are most likely to occur when we need to make a quick decision. So if we allow more time for that decision-making process, it's much more likely that people will reflect on that process and challenge faulty thinking if they have that time to do so. And then finally, the last way, and this is how we'll wrap up the rest of the webinar, is focused on using more objective data. So while all of these approaches have proven to be somewhat successful in reducing biases or errors in decision-making, ultimately the best way to prevent these errors is to take the peer, the manager, the senior leadership ratings out of the equation and supplement this with data that's much more objective for making succession planning decisions. So with that, we propose this improved succession planning process, the rating process of calibrating managers and peer ratings, integrating these, that can all really be replaced with an annual assessment program. And assessments offer a number of advantages as compared to the manager and peer ratings. Assessments and algorithms that often operate behind the scenes do not have personal relationships with your leaders. They don't have a preference for one person over the other. They're a much more objective way to make decisions and to collect data for making decisions. So I'll talk a little bit more about the objective assessments that we offer. The most valid and objective assessments to use for leaders are virtual simulations, also known as virtual assessment centers. For those that may not be familiar with assessment centers, this approach started in about the 1950s as a face-to-face method, wherein executives would fly into a specific location. They would be asked to assume the role of a fictitious leader in a fictitious organization and complete a number of different tasks that are commonly asked of leaders. And then a team of trained observers would watch and rate what that person did. A team that was objective, so third party, no relation to this person prior to this assessment center, and would evaluate them on a number of different competencies. However, this was a very costly and time-intensive process. in terms of flying people in, and then it was normally a full day process. So what was once this costly, time-intensive process is now available online and at a fraction of the cost, and can be completed without any travel requirements. And that's what we specialize here at Pinsight, is the virtual assessment centers. And it's very much the same notion. Participants are immersed in the fictitious company. They assume the role of a leader, and a 3-hour entirely virtual experience, they're asked to perform a number of different tasks, such as role-playing with trained professionals that are playing the role of a direct report or a supervisor. Maybe they're asked to formulate a strategic plan or a project plan, depending on their level of leadership. And meanwhile, a team of trained professionals are still observing and rating that leader's performance with a number of different tasks on standardized competency models. So the simulation scenarios are really designed to eliminate situational influences on the person's performance, meaning that everyone goes through the same set of experiences. It also eliminates the in-group bias of managers by leaving those ratings to trained professionals without that previous relationship in the organization. From a logistical standpoint, making assessment centers virtual has really allowed this process to be streamlined. So with a few clicks of a button, participants are added, they complete their pre-work, they go through their 3-hour simulation, and then 24 hours later, you have a wealth of analytics available to you that are not prone to the same biases that we see with manager and peer ratings. And I'll spend the next minute or so going through some of those analytics that are available. So one of the great aspects of this process is that you receive really detailed data about that person's current ability and future potential. This readiness screen shows us at a high level an overview of our participants, of our group of leaders, so that we can compare amongst them and really determine who's ready now to achieve our goals, or who needs to be developed in 6 months versus 12 months. And this type of information is incredibly difficult for humans to calculate, especially given all the biases that come into play. But the algorithms that are calculating this do not have the same biases. They evaluate everyone the exact same, thereby allowing for more objective and accurate data. Likewise, the 9-box grid, whereas traditionally this is a lengthy group discussion where we're looking at peer ratings, trying to compile this, trying to determine where do these people fall within our 9-box grid. Virtual simulation software can automatically create this for you without any discussion. That way the discussion can occur afterwards, and the time can be better spent determining, okay, what does development look like? Now that we know where our bench strength is, what do we do with this information? And then likewise, the virtual simulation software can immediately tell you what the training needs are for leaders. So there's no need to manually interpret those performance ratings or compare across groups. The training needs analysis offers an automated blueprint for development curriculum. At the individual level, the detailed analytics are available to help make succession planning decisions while at the same time helping the leaders make development decisions. So what are the next steps once those key successors are identified? For example, each participant receives a SWOT analysis that immediately tells them what are their key strengths, weaknesses, development opportunities, and threats. So they're able to see immediately where they stand now and what they need to develop. And then the last report I'll share is there's a competency detail. Participants get very detailed feedback on each of their competencies, and this is really where the real value of the simulation assessment becomes apparent. So all competencies are measured in at least 2 different exercises, allowing for that person to compare across situations. And with all the biases that we discussed, it's highly unlikely that performance ratings are going to actually accurately capture that across-situation performance. As we discussed, we're more likely to remember and focus on specific events, specific situations, rather than consider the entire person across situations. And then likewise, this is very specific behavioral feedback for leaders. Feedback they're more likely to buy into as a result of the objective nature of how it was derived. So to summarize, in summary, succession planning is a very intricate, complex process of decision making, and oftentimes this is a group decision making process as well. And like any decision-making process, we really want the best data available to make those decisions, to really maximize the chance that we're making the right decision. Biases are, of course, a major source of error in the traditional succession planning process when we're using manager, peer, senior leader ratings, or worse, just asking for subjective impressions and opinions, as we often do when manually creating that 9-box grid. We're left with an extremely difficult and complex problem identifying key successors without very good data to inform that decision. And then finally, the succession planning decisions that we make are really only as good as the data that we use to make those decisions, like any decision. So when we're using bias data, chock full of errors, it becomes very difficult, if not impossible, to make accurate and rational decisions about succession planning. And then when we consider the amount of time and money that goes into the succession planning process, as well as turnover costs, replacement costs, training costs, I'd argue that this is a really important process to make sure we're getting right from the get-go. Andy, was there anything you wanted to add to the webinar before we turn to see if there's any questions?
No, I did. You know what? No, I thought, thank you very much for presenting. Thought it was excellent material. Made me think of a lot of things that occurred during my management career with various companies out there and how we could have possibly have done it better. But we do have some questions that have come in that if you're ready, if you're finished up, I'll fire some questions at you.
Sure. Let's
Okay. First one comes in. Yeah, the first one that came in is, what do you do if you think others are being biased? And I'm assuming they're talking about what if other managers are being biased. What do you do?
Yeah, that can be a difficult situation because so many of these are unconscious and they occur without our awareness. It's not as simple as really, pointing it out to someone and they'll be like, oh, you're right, I did that. But that's never really the case. So there's ways to kind of challenge someone's thinking, I would say, and similar as you would in a coaching relationship, to just encourage that person to think more critically about how they're processing information, how they're thinking about information, maybe the information they're excluding or not considering when they're making a decision. So oftentimes, for example, a devil's advocate can be a really great role for combating some of these biases. And this is something that a lot of companies do, and I highly recommend, is appointing someone. So maybe it's a rotating position where someone is appointed to be that devil's advocate so that you do get someone that's really challenging your thinking. Aside from that, I would say, buying them the Kahneman book might be a good solution. But ways of increasing awareness and encouraging them to really think a little bit more critically about their thinking are kind of the best approaches you can take. So certainly not always going to be successful.
And this kind of relates to that. The other question came in is, another one that came in is, how can I recognize if bias is occurring? I know there's not like a big giant red check mark that comes across from somebody, but is there a way of rooting through that?
That is a really good question. So I had mentioned earlier that I notice myself making biases all the time. And so part of that, again, comes from the awareness. Once you are aware what biases can influence your decision, particularly if you've stopped and spent time thinking about when biases are most likely to occur. So for example, for me, when I'm driving and I get upset with another driver, I know that I'm prone to make the fundamental attribution error. So really, awareness, context, specificity. Beyond that, I would say it's a difficult thing to know when we're making biases, particularly when we're moving quickly, when you don't have time to stop and reflect on each decision you're making or each process that you're going through. It can be a difficult process, but research suggests that with practice and awareness that people can improve their ability to recognize biases, but not necessarily stop them.
Okay, fantastic. Had another question come in specifically to the Pinsight tool. Do you use the Lominger competency set?
That is a good question. We do not necessarily use the Lominger competency set. However, we have mapped on our competencies to that competency set so that it's easy to see kind of how our competencies relate to those, because we know that that's a popularly used framework.
Okay. Another question specific to Pinsight. What makes our trained observers more objective than my managers?
That's a very good question. So there's a number of things we do with our team of what we call them assessors to help diminish the amount of biases that go into it. So first and foremost, we hire people that have educational background in this field so that they have some of that awareness, as well as experience making behavioral ratings. So ideally, anytime you're making a behavioral rating, there's some information presented to you about what biases might come into play, how you can combat those. So that's the first hurdle. Second hurdle is we definitely train for it. So we have quite a bit of awareness training or frame of reference training that research has suggested is helpful in diminishing, not diminishing the biases, but allowing people to recognize when they are occurring. And then likewise, we provide very concrete examples for our assessors. So for example, you're rating this particular exercise or this particular behavior. Here might be how a bias might affect that particular rating. On top of that, we structure the rating process to avoid that. So for example, there's never just one person rating everything a leader did, and that helps us avoid some of the halo error that we see. And then finally, we do statistical analysis, so we can analyze the assessors' ratings and look for patterns across the exercises, look for patterns that are attributable to the assessor themselves. So we can statistically tell if there's something going on in that data. It's not going to tell us specifically what bias is occurring, but it gives us enough information to know, is this good data, or is there something else going on here?
Fantastic, and we've got another one. Do you have training available to handle results of the assessments?
We do. That is a really good question. So we do have a number of training programs available more for the client, the HR manager, hiring manager, consultant, coach, whoever that might be that's kind of facilitating the assessment process. But we do have a certification process that goes through how do you debrief this with participants, what's the recommended process, how do you have a coaching conversation around this tool. So there's quite a bit of training available in that regard.
Well, fantastic. Well, we've run out of time here. Any last comments there, Christy?
No, I just wanted to thank everyone for their time today on the webinar. These were some great questions that came up, and I hope this was helpful and informative for people to start questioning and challenging their own thinking. I think it behooves us as a society to think a little bit more about our biases, and certainly in the context of succession planning, but elsewhere as well. So I appreciate everyone's time on the webinar, and it was a pleasure sharing this with you.
Yeah, thank you once again, everybody, for attending today. Just a reminder, we will be sending out your activity ID that you can submit for recertification credits. So once again, thank you very much. Hope you got some good details, good information out of this webinar, and I hope we get you to attend another one soon. Thanks again, Christy, thank you, and everybody have a safe rest of the week and weekend.
Great. Thank you, Andy. Take care.
Take care.